Lynn, this is a reflection of many questions that we've gotten from both inside and outside the United States. This particular question comes from Temba, who's asking you the question from Tanzania. He says, Mr. LaRouche, the cause of the financial system failure may be caused by financial management system regulation or whatever. But since you're an expert on this topic, we're going to pose this question to you since we've been unable to figure it out. Could you please explain, if you would, how structural investment vehicles were formed and what their effects are to the global economy? Also, who owns these things? And what are we to do with them? Thank you. Nobody seems to know this, by the way.
Well, first of all, it's a fake. It's a swindle. It's a looting. And if you look at the results of the practice where this occurs, is promoted, you see the effect. It's all looting. There's nothing, as I said just before, take the case of Africa. Africa has the largest area of agricultural production of any continent. It has a population, to the extent it's not being killed by AIDS, which is talented for this purpose. But they have a very low level of technological skill otherwise. Now, what do you do? Well, what you do is what I've been proposing since I did a proposal actually aimed at Nigeria back in the early 1980s on the plan of action which had been developed in that period, the Lagos Plan of Action. And it was obvious to me that because of the low technological productivity factor in the African population in general, that if we looked at the problems that the African farmer had faced, and they were largely African farmers, then you would see what had to be done. You would take, for example, look at what they produce as farmers from inception of planting the crop and so forth. And you find out the bugs are eating them up. The bugs and diseases are eating them up. The problem is the African farmer had no local institutions which were capable of dealing with this challenge of bugs and infestations. If you normally have local stations in a place like Africa, where quasi-jungle areas or quasi-tropical areas, and you would have local facilities which would help the farmers deal with problems of infestations and other kinds of things, like an agricultural advisory capability, which is functional as opposed to just commentary or advice. Then you would ensure that you had methods of transportation. And remember, Africa is the largest farming area of the continent. And you would try to ensure that the food was not destroyed in the process of being delivered to places for people who are going to consume it. This required mass transportation systems. This required power systems. It required facilities of the type I indicated. In that case, you would increase the net productivity of the African farmer per capita and per square kilometer without necessarily having to re-educate him as a farmer. You would simply give him the means to make his work more effective. And that would raise the standard of living, and once the standard of living starts to be raised, then you can go on a process of technological and other kinds of progress. That's the solution. It's still a solution today. We do not have any large-scale rail systems throughout Africa. We do not have the kinds of power facilities that I indicated. We do not have the institutions to give the kind of assistance against disease, tropical diseases and so forth, which are required. Why? Because they don't want it done. And you go back to 1975 when Kissinger wrote a report on U.S. policy under the 1970s. And that is that the African population is already too large. It must be reduced. We must not increase its productivity or size. Because if we do so, the African population will consume too much of the raw materials which we have designated for our future use. So there's a deliberate policy of Africa of genocide. And once you understand that, once you understand what the alternative was and is still, and you understand what the opposition is and where it comes from, as from London, from the London School of Race Relations, for example, which ran the Mau Mau operation in Africa, Kenya before, and is back at it in Kenya again today, the same kind of operation. And what happened to Mozambique and all these other places. Now you understand the problem. There is an enemy out there, an enemy of mankind, which happens to, among its other targets, choose Africa. And that's an example of this.